Morning, everyone. Welcome to Northcross. My name's Han. I'm one of the pastors here. Good to see all of you. It's a very, very beautiful sunny day. And I probably mentioned this before, but when you look at the studies and research done around why people don't attend church, the number one factor, the number one reason is actually weather. So when there's good weather, evidently people don't go to church. So great to see you here. So if you have been around Northcross for a while, or maybe you're here for the first time, we're studying through the book of Judges. So please get your Bibles out. Let's turn to Judges 18. I'll avoid that spot. So we've been going through the book of Judges, and now last week we looked at chapter 17, and from 17 onwards to the end of the book is an appendix that's been added on by the author to kind of show, hey, this is how messed up things had gotten. When there was no king, which remember we talked about, that's used as a euphemism to say God's direction, without God leading in that nation, this is how messed up things had become. And yesterday we read the story about this guy Micah and the Levite priest. So very quickly, this is what happened. There was a guy called Micah, and his mum was rich, and she had tons of money, and evidently he had stolen that money from her. And then he overhears her putting a curse on whoever stole that money. So he goes, oh, I don't want that curse. So he fesses up to Mummy and says, Mum, I stole the money, here it is. And then she says, praise the Lord, like awesome. And she takes some of that money and dedicates it to God by melting it down and making an idol. And then Micah decides, oh, okay, sweet, we're going to have a little mini church, a little area, a shrine of worship, idol worship in my house. And then there's this Levite. He's knocking about, he's sojourning, he's walking around. Even though he had other priestly duties, he decides, you know what, I'm just going to go out and branch out and do my own thing. And as he's doing that, he bumps into Micah, and Micah eventually hires him as his personal priest for his own house. And so this guy, the priest for hire, goes along and decides that he's going to be a priest in that house. And the book ends with Micah saying, okay, now God's going to bless me because my idol worship is going to be led by a Levite. And then really the whole thrust of 17 onwards is like, this is how messed up things are. Today we are in chapter 18, a pretty long passage. So I'm not going to read through all of it. What I'll do is let me just tell you what happens, and then we'll engage with the text as we go through the points. And actually, as I do that, Rachel, if you could chuck that map up, please, so we can just kind of get a geographical visual image of what's taking place. So chapter 18 starts, we've just had this whole thing about Micah saying, yeah, God's going to bless me because a Levite is leading this idol worship. And then we get to chapter 18, and we get to the story of the tribe of Dan. You can see up there, they've been allocated a land, but they're seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in. For until then, no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. So Dan, they've been allocated a piece of land, but they, for whatever reason, don't have it yet. And so they send 5 spies out to go look for some new land for them. 5 spies. From Zorah and Eshtaol, so you can see that on the map. And then so they go through Ephraim, where Micah's hanging out. We looked at that last week, and that's in that green bit. And as they go through, they pass through Micah's place, and they lodge there. And when they were there, they recognized the voice, or some translation will say recognize the accent of the Levite. And they go, hey man, what are you doing here? You're a Levite. You shouldn't be doing this. What's going on? And he tells them, oh, yeah, this is what Micah did. He hired me, and I've become his priest. And so these guys, these 5 spies that are looking out for the new land, they go, okay, this guy's a priest. And so they ask him, hey, so like this mission that we're on, is God going to bless this? Like, is God with us in this? Which is a very silly thing to think about if you're like this guy, this priest that's totally living in sin and facilitating idol worship and not doing his proper duties. They ask that guy, yeah, do you think God's with us? Like, I don't know if he's the guy to go for sound advice about God. But anyway, he says, yep, go in peace, like God's with you. Like, he actually says, Yahweh, your journey is under the eye of Yahweh. So the 5 guys, they departed and they get to Laish up there on the top. And they get to Laish and they see that it's a beautiful, bountiful place. And the text keeps saying that it's an unsuspecting people. And it's just like, the land is awesome, this place is great, and it's so fresh, and there's water, and it's a fantastic place, and there's no one else nearby. This is looking good for us. They're quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth, and possessing wealth, and how they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. So then they came to their brothers at Zorah and Eshtaol, and they say, hey, what's the deal? What did you find up there? And they say, arise, we got to go take this land. It's awesome. They're not expecting us. Let's go do it. So 600 men of the tribe of Dan, armed with weapons of war, they set out to go there. And as they go through, they go to the house of Micah, right? So they're down, those 2 cities in the red down the bottom, and they've got to make their way up. So they're going through Micah's place again. And as they do that, those 5 guys that stayed with Micah go, hey, so we're going to go and take over Laish, and we're going to have this new land. And what would be really helpful for us would be to set up a place of worship. And so they're like, the 5 spies are like, hey, you know what? There's this dude Micah, and he's got a Levite leading worship for him. And I saw an ephod, which was like a garment that priests wore. I saw an ephod, I saw idols there. Why don't we just take that? So they go through Micah's place, they grab the stuff, and they loot him. The Levites are like, yo, hey, wait, slow down, what's going on? And they basically say to him, hey, shut your mouth. Do you want to come be a priest for just this house, or do you want to come be a priest for our whole tribe? And of course, this guy, a new lucrative offer comes along, so the priest is like, oh, yep, I'll do it. Yeah, it's way better. So he goes along with the Danites, takes all the worship, the idol worship, and goes with the Danites. Now Micah and his neighbors hear about this, and they're not too happy, right? And the neighbors aren't happy because if it can happen to Micah, if they've come and looted him, then it can happen to me, it can happen to her. So the neighborhood kind of get together, and they confront the Danites, and they go, hey, what's the deal? And the Danites basically say, what are you going to do about it? They go up, they conquer Laish, and it ends with, and the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves. Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up Micah's carved image that he made as long as the house of God was in Shiloh. So that's Judges 18. This morning, I would love to share with us 4 observations that we can make from the text, and they're all up there right now. So the first observation I want to make is that rather than expecting God to bless our plans and all our desires and our efforts, actually the correct way to do things is to seek God first and obey him and his plans. You see, what we see of these Danites is they made their own plans. They decide, oh, actually, God has said this, but we're going to make our own plans, and then we're going to go and do that. And then they bump into the Levite and say, oh, hey, is God going to bless our endeavors here? Bless our disobedience? This is what verse 1 says. Dan was seeking an inheritance to dwell in. And it says, no inheritance had fallen to them. So in Joshua 18, we actually read of an allotment for Dan, right? And you saw it on that map just before. For whatever reason, they hadn't taken it yet. Now, you might say, was it laziness? Were they just not, it was too much effort to go and do this, so they didn't go do it? Were they unhappy with the allotment of land? I don't know. Probably they were unable to take over the land. If you look in you don't have to, but I'll go to Judges chapter 1, verse 34, and it just gives us a kind of a hint. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. So we're getting kind of hints there of like, okay, maybe they haven't taken that land fully because the Amorites and later on the Philistines kind of given them a hard time to do it. So even so, that might sound like a reasonable reason for us to be like, oh yeah, they're unable to take the land because they're fighting. But if you think about it, I think it's actually the real issue is a distrust of God. Because God had actually proven himself to them and promised them this land. And so no matter what kind of opposition that came across their way, they should have been singing with us, the battle belongs to God. And I'm going to fight on my knees. And I'm going to pray to God. God, like these Amorites, they're pushing us back. It's really hard work. God, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to try a different tactic? Do you want us to get some help from another tribe? Or like, do you know what I mean? They should have been inquiring to God, seeking his help for how do we live out your will, rather than, God said this, we're going to disobey that, and we're going to go do our own thing. They should have sought God's will first. And this is what we do, right? We make big plans. Maybe this year you have made big plans for yourself and your family, and we're kind of expecting God just to bless it. And maybe sometimes our plans are rooted in disobedience, like clearly going against what God has shared in his will for us, and yet expecting God to bless us. It's like God becomes an afterthought. And the reality is God is not obliged to bless whatever plans that we make. God is not a genie. He's not a vending machine where if we pray the right thing, that his hands are tight. I have to bless his venture into exploiting people because he prayed this prayer. No, God is not obliged to do anything. Now, God in his grace and his sovereign will and his wisdom might, for whatever reason, decide to let things work out and bless us even though we disobey him. Like, that's God's prerogative. God can do whatever he wants. He's smarter than you and I are, so whatever. That's up to God. But we can't expect God and have any sense of expectation that when we just make whatever plans we want, that God is actually entitled, that we're entitled from God, that he has to bless it. You might be thinking, brother, what do you know? Your hair is not gray. You still have a full head of hair. So you have no wisdom. You've got nothing to teach me. You have no life experience like Andrew or Mark. And maybe that's true. So I want to invite Peter up. Peter, infinitely wiser and smarter than I am, and he's going to share a quick story, a quick testimony of how this has played out in his life. How we, human beings, in our default setting of sin, decide to make plans and expect God to bless it rather than seeking and inquiring of God first. Thanks, Peter.
I'm going to talk briefly about the first point up there, where everyone did right in his own eyes, and I did not. I did that in the past. And that's what I wanted to share with you this morning. Many of you know that I was a pharmacist once, and our job when I first started was to actually make things. Believe it or not, we didn't count pills or wrap a label around a tube of ointment. We actually made them from the beginning. We would get the plants, Digitalis purpurea, the plant Digitalis purpurea, from which the heart medicine Digitalis comes from. There were no pills when I first started in pharmacy for that. You actually had a mixture of Digitalis. And by using it in soaking the plant in alcohol, you actually extracted out the active ingredient that did good. Now that was something that was done back in those days. And I'd amalgamated with another pharmacy, and we had a very good business. But we were businessmen, and we thought, even with that, I mean, I had enough of an income to pay for flying lessons, because the Air Force wouldn't teach me. I couldn't get in for some reason. Anyway, we had that money that I could actually take time out to fly aeroplanes, which was a childhood dream of mine. But we came to the point where we thought, we need to do something more, my partner and I. And at that time, some of you ladies, so many of you may know this. If you look down through the local mall, you'll come across a shop called the Body Shop. Well, we thought we would like to do something like that, and we just started to do all the work on it. And I did a lot of the preparatory work, all the mathematics. And they gave when you were in a mall, an opening had arisen in a mall. They've got all these figures that you can say, look, you're going to have X thousand people a week going past your front door, and you're going to get so many of them, a certain number will come into the shop, and from that you should be able to expect thus and so. And we did all this work and thought, yes, we were certain that this would be a success, but it wasn't. I had thought all along while we were talking about this, there was a gnawing feeling going on in the pit of my stomach that there's something wrong. Now, I had not put this to the Lord at all. Yes, I was a Christian at that stage, and yes, I was a regular churchgoer, but I didn't think that this was something I should bother the Lord with. No, He's given me a brain, I can work this out. Yeah, all the mathematics said, yes, you'll make a profit from this. And I even had one for the bank manager that said, this is what will happen if we don't make the mark. You will still get your money back. Well, so the bank manager thought, oh, yes, he's right. And they gave us the money to do it. It was very, very costly, all the fixtures and fittings. But as I said, after a little while, the thing just didn't work out for us. I'm not going to go through the angst that it was causing us at the time. But the point is, it failed. We had to sell it, and we had to sell it. And we wanted to quit it fast, and we sold it for a bargain price. My partner and I lost between us $250,000 back then. And it was a lot of money. And but we got out of it. But I always, and I felt the relief. But I thought, had I asked God when this gnawing feeling of doubt was coming over me, would I have done differently? When my partner said to us, the final thing, we have to make a decision tomorrow, where are we going with this? And I said, let's do it. And that's what it cost us, $250,000 for my not asking the Lord the right thing to do.
Thanks for sharing that. So, yeah, we do that, right? We figure God has given us brains. We're smart. We're capable people. Let's go and do our own thing without taking the time to seek God's will. So thank you, Peter. Second observation we want to look at is this idea that without God, the people with power have free rein to exploit those who are weak and vulnerable. See, this is what takes place here. We see Micah, his household gets looted, and Laish, the city, gets conquered. And the great irony of this is Dan means judge. They're the tribe of justice, and they are perpetrating injustice among those who are weaker and more vulnerable than they are. So we look at this case with Micah's house. The Danites, they're on their way to take the land and decide to loot Micah. And from verse 14 onwards, we see these 5 spies. They decide they're going to go and steal from Micah's house. Verse 17, and the 5 men who had gone out to scout out the land went up and entered and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, while the priest stood by the entrance of the gate with the 600 men armed with weapons of war. And remember, so Micah says to them, hey, what are you doing, mate? They tell him, shut up, come with us. More lucrative. He says, yep. And then when we get to verse 21, and Micah and his mates, they come out. This is kind of funny / sad. You look in verse 21. They turned and departed, putting the little ones and the livestock and the goods in front of them, which is just because they know that people are going to come and attack them. When they had gone a distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house were called out, and they overtook the people of Dan. They shouted to Dan, and this is what the people of Dan, the Danites, who have just robbed this guy, this is what they say to Micah. Hey, mate. Well, yeah. Hey, mate, what's the problem? That's what they say to him. They go, what's the problem? And Micah's here in verse 24. He goes, you take my gods that I made and the priests and go away, and what have I left? How do you then ask me, what is the matter with you? Right? Like, how audacious is that? They steal from this guy and they go, hey, mate, what's the matter? What's the matter? You just robbed me. What are you talking about? And then what the Danites say to Micah is, well, you better watch what you say, otherwise, an accident might happen. Basically saying, hey, like, you be quiet, otherwise we're going to kill you. Then the people of Dan went their way. And when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his home. I mean, this is just bullying. We are stronger than you. We have more people. We've got weapons. We're going to steal from you. And what are you going to do about it? Absolutely nothing. The strong come and rob the weak. Laish, verse 7, verse 10, it keeps telling us that this is a beautiful place. And they say, I want it, and I'm going to take it. And the passage keeps telling us they're an unsuspecting people. And so they decide, oh yeah, we're just going to go through, we're just going to go blitzkrieg them and just walk in there, take everything. And then verse 27 and 28, it says they took what Micah had made and the priests that belonged to him, and they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob. Then they rebuilt the city and lived in it. They had no right, they had no authority to come and do this, but they wanted it, and they could do it, so they went and did it. In 1 Kings chapter 21, we read this famous story about Jezebel and King Ahab. And there was a guy called Naboth, and he had a vineyard. And King Ahab decided, I want that vineyard. But Naboth said, no thanks, I want to hold on to my property. And long story short, Jezebel and Ahab decide, hey, actually, we have all the power, and we're just going to take it. And so God's speaking through the prophet Elijah condemns them in the strongest terms to say, yeah, you can't just do this. Those with power, just because you're stronger, you can't just go through and prey on the people who are weaker than you. But this is what happens without God's direction. And without God, why not? Why not do that? I mean, it's a dog-eat-dog world. It's survival of the fittest. So if I can get ahead and do well for myself by trampling over you who's weaker than I am, then why not? Why not abort that child if he or she is going to be a nuisance to my life? Why not exploit that person if it's going to help me get ahead in life? Why not? And this is why we need Christians to meaningfully interact and engage with unbelievers and to be a light and to bring light into areas of the world where darkness is pervasive, where the strong prey on the weak, where the vulnerable are taken advantage of. This is where Christians we need to step up and bring light into those areas. Christians, as we follow the example of Jesus, who himself had no reason to show us grace or mercy, but he came down to us, and those of us who actually deserved his wrath, he actually decided, I'm going to serve these people. I'm going to die for these people. I'm going to sacrifice myself for these people instead of smashing us, which is what we deserve. So this is what happens when we remove God. The powerful have every right to just go and dominate the weak. Third point I want us to look at is that being isolated means we are vulnerable and prone to danger. The author constantly repeats this idea of Laish being vulnerable and isolated and being far away from everyone. Verse 7, they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. Verse 28, they had no deliverer because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. Proverbs 18 is going to tell us that whoever isolates himself seeks after his own desire. And we learned last week that our own desires aren't always good. Whoever isolates himself seeks after his own desire. He breaks out against all sound judgment. It's saying it's not a good thing to be isolated. It's not good to break away from other people because it leaves us prone to danger. And I mention this because, if we think about this new year and we have great plans, which hopefully we've sought God first, but we have all these plans of how we want to do well and stuff. If we want to do well, particularly spiritually, if we want to do well this year, we have to fight against that voice of laziness in our head that says, actually, I'll just do things by myself. I don't need other people around me. People are people and can be problematic. No, I'll just rather stick to myself, especially us guys. We have to fight against that. If we want to do well, fight isolation and meaningfully interact and engage and participate in community. And as we think about who we are as a church, we have this special thing where we get together every week with the same group of people, more or less, and are invested in something significant, i.e. the gospel, together. And so we actually have a great launching pad here at church to build meaningful relationships and friendships. Is it easy? Definitely not. Is it worth it? Absolutely. So today, after the service at 12:30, we have a potluck lunch at the Mun's house. We can get the address to you if you want it. So there's going to be like a 25-meter slip and slide for everyone, I guess, but primarily the kids. Hay bale rides, there's table tennis, there's volleyball, there's cold drinks, all of that. And that's great, that's wonderful. But the most important thing that's there, even greater than volleyball and slip and slide, is that there is going to be people there. And there's going to be people there with whom this event, a simple potluck lunch, could be the first step in building meaningful friendships with. Am I saying if you attend the lunch today that you're going to build an awesome, strong community around you and not have any spiritual struggles ever again for the rest of your life? No, obviously not. I'm just saying this is a stepping stone. If we want to build meaningful relationships with friends and build friendships in our church, then this is a great first step to take. I actually remember the last time we did this and the conversations. I still remember the exact people I met, and I know them to this day, and the conversations we had. This is how we build friendships. So I don't know how many people are in this room right now, but if every single one of us could and overwhelm the property, it would be great. And not great so we can say, oh yeah, all 200-300 people showed up. No, don't care about that. Yay, it's great because all these people were in a place where hopefully we can take a first step to building friendships and fight against this loneliness and isolation pandemic that we live in the 21st century. We see in the text, the author, I think, is particularly specific about pointing it out. That's why they keep saying they had no dealings with anyone. They were isolated. They were vulnerable. The last thing that I want to highlight in today's text is that even one seemingly small, seemingly personal and private act, and in this case, an act of sin, can have massive ramifications. At the end of this chapter, we see this in full play. So in verse 30, and the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and some of your translations might say son of Manasseh, which some people say that the reason it's different in some translations, like it was changed in some places, because people were like reading it and going, man, from the lineage of Moses himself are engaging in idol worship? No, we got to change it. So some of your translations might say Manasseh. Son of Moses and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up Micah's carved image that he had made, so long as the house of God was at Shiloh. So what we see here is that they're engaging in idol worship with this false priesthood. That's not how the priesthood was supposed to work. And instead of going to the tabernacle, which at that point was in Shiloh, they set up their own system. Remember last week we talked about how God has actually determined this is how you approach me, this is how worship of me is done. God had set those rules out, but they're breaking away, doing their own thing. They're setting up their own system. And this carried on for 400 odd years until the day of the captivity in verse 30. And in verse 31, they set up the image as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. So as I read that, one of the things I looked at was, is that one event or is that two? Is verse 30 until the day of captivity, and verse 31 set up the image as long as the house of God was at Shiloh? Was that one event or two? Like, is it the Philistines coming through and destroying Shiloh, or is it the Assyrian captivity? The answer is I don't know. People speculate. But the main point, regardless of whether it's talking about one event or two, the main point is that people were engaging in false worship. They were engaging in idol worship for ages, for many, many years. The whole tribe was engaged in idol worship. Why and how? Because this one silly lady decided, I'm going to take these pieces of silver and melt it down and make an idol out of this. And that one silly lady's actions meant that this idol was stolen and taken to Laish, set up, and worshipped for 400 odd years. 400, one small act by this lady led to thousands, probably thousands of people being led astray into idol worship. And so the warning for us there is that we need to take God's directive seriously when he says that sin is a big deal. No matter how small we think the sin is, no matter how personal and private we think that sin is, we need to take God seriously when he says that sin is a big deal, and understand that it can have massive ripple effects. And so that means we got to kill sin. When we know that there is sin in our lives, we got to crucify it, crucify the flesh. And of course, we fight against sin and we kill sin in the full knowledge that God is with us by his Spirit, that he has empowered us, and that because of all that Jesus Christ is for us, that we're actually already victorious. Like the penalty of the sin in our lives, that God is not holding that over our heads. And so actually we're on the winning team. It's light, it's easy in that sense. Like we can fight against sin and kill sin knowing that actually I'm on the winning team. And it doesn't become this begrudging like, oh, another list of 15 things I'm not allowed to do and I need to do all these things to win God's approval. No. If you're a child of God, you're a child of God, and we kill sin because that's good for us. We kill sin because it's good for other people. We kill sin because it's what God wants, and it enables us to have a more intimate relationship with God. So when we see sin in our life, we've got to kill it. because even the smallest personal sin, as we've seen here, can have massive ramifications. On the flip side, though, that's kind of a negative thing. On the flip side, let's think about it like this as we are in 2025. What about one small act of faith? What about one small act of obedience? What might God do with one small act of faith and obedience? Ephesians is going to tell us that God is able to do immeasurably more than we ask or imagine. And so if one silly woman's sin can lead thousands of people astray, then what might our one small act of obedience, what kind of ripple effects, positive, gospel-oriented ripple effects might that have? And it might be as simple as inviting your neighbor over for dinner, or talking to your mate on your football team, or inviting them to church, or just something very simple like that. I want to tell you a story about a missionary named John Bechtel. And my apologies if you've come through the youth group and you've heard this story before. So John Bechtel was a missionary in Hong Kong. And at that point, I don't have it written here, but there were numbers around like the percentage of the population who were under 18, and it was massive. And he had a dream to have a camp for teenagers that he saw loitering around in the streets. So he found a closed hotel, and he decided, this would be a perfect place to build a conference center where we can have camps. The only problem was it was being sold for $250,000. This was in 1971. So he's trying to raise money, and he's got an American friend by the name of Walter Malone. Cool name, Walter Malone. He was an influential businessman, and he believed in John's vision. And so he arranged a speaking tour and said, look, I'm an influential businessman. Maybe he didn't say those words himself, but I have contacts, and we're going to fundraise money for you so that you can build this thing and reach the young people of Hong Kong. 3 months later, Walter Malone sends John a note, and it says this: Dear John, I'm sorry, I tried my best. I couldn't raise the funds. Only one person responded. I enclosed it. So in the letter was another envelope. He opens up the envelope, and it was a note from a little girl named Belinda Holmes. Dear Mr. Bechtel, I heard about your plan. I've been praying about it. I'd like to give you my ice cream money. Here is $1. Please use it to buy the camp. So John was disappointed, right? Had these big dreams, big aspirations, and they made $1. But his wife said, this is the money you got, take it to the board. So he took it to the board and said, I'd like to buy the camp for $1. He gave it to the caretaker, who laughed it off, but then apparently he gave him all the legal reasons why, actually, if you don't bring this to the board, you are liable for blah, 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 blah. And so the caretaker took the money and presented it to the board. The board prayed about it and agreed to sell the whole place to John for $1. And since its inception, Swin Do Camp has had approximately 155,000 young people come to faith at the camp. All because one smart girl made one small act of faith, one small act of obedience. Sure, our small acts of sin can lead people astray. But as we go into this new year, what if we thinking, one small act of obedience, one small act of faith, what might God do with that? He's able to do immeasurably more than we ask or imagine. As I pray, I'll just invite